Hey beauty friends, I'm Meredith Roddy from Beading and Artistic Wire. Welcome to the 2024 Jewel School Workshops. Today I'm going to be teaching a multi-strand necklace. We're going to be learning all kinds of great crimping skills. And whether you are an advanced beader who has been doing this for decades or a brand new beader who has never strung a bead on a wire before, I think you'll be able to get something really good out of this class. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and let's get to stringing. First, I'm going to go over all of the different materials that you are going to need for class. We are going to be stringing on 49 strand Beading bead stringing wire. This is the absolute best bead stringing wire of all of the bead stringing wire out there. I am using 49 strand because I want my necklace to be very, very flexible. I'm using 018 because you can see right here, the 018, and I'm using 018 because that is the diameter of the wire. And even though I'm using some big beads, I'm also going to be using very, very small beads as my spacers. And a thicker wire, an 024 wire, is not going to go through those little beads. As you are stringing up any design, these are the first things that you need to think about. You need to think about which beading wire you're going to use, and that is informed by what beads you use, and more specifically, what hole sizes of the beads. You want to fill up the beads holes as much as possible for really well constructed jewelry. Some of the other supplies that you are going to need for this project are number 2 crimp tubes. You are also going to need some wire guardians and some crimp covers. We are going to be covering all of the basics of bead stringing. And these 3 findings are the 3 findings that you are going to need when you are starting your necklace. You're going to need crimps, either tubes or beads. In this case, I'm using crimp tubes, and I'm using a number 2 crimp tube because that's what it tells me right here on my wire, right? We're back to that spool of wire. We went 49 strand because we want our necklace to be the most flexible. We're going with 018 because we want it to be the correct diameter. And right down here, it tells me I want to use a number 2 crimp tube or a number 1 crimp bead. If you're that is a matter of personal preference. You can use a number 1 crimp bead or a number 2 crimp tube. Those are the correct sizes for your necklace. And for both of those, you are going to be using a standard crimp tool. And we have in this necklace 6 opportunities to get our crimping absolutely perfect. So at the end of this project, you are going to be an expert in crimping. And even if you've done this many, many times previously, I'm hoping that there might be a tip or trick that you didn't know that you can take away from our workshop today. The beads that we are going to be using for the workshop today are these beautiful tiger eye beads. We are using 10 millimeters, 8 millimeters, and 6 millimeters for 3 different strands. This is a multi-strand design. And we're going to do some spacer beads in between these little teeny tiny 2 or 3 millimeter spinel beads, because who doesn't love a challenge? We need a little challenge to get those guys strung up on our bead stringing wire. So of course, the last thing that we are going to need is a clasp. I'm using a 3-strand clasp for this design. There are a lot of different ways a lot of different clasps that you can use. I really like this one with the spacer bars because it allows my design to be really well spaced and laid out, especially as I'm wearing it on my body. A couple of things that are nice to haves for this project are bead stoppers. And bead stoppers are these little springy guys that you put on the ends of your beading wire as you're stringing to make sure that your beads don't slide away. Once you have a bead stopper and you use it in your design, you'll never go back. You'll never not use bead stoppers. I can't recommend these guys enough. If you have a bead board is a great tool for designing. Because I have already laid out and spaced out my project, I won't be using a bead board today, but it's a really good thing to have on hand. For tools, I already mentioned we're going to need those crimping pliers. That is the standard crimping plier. And the reason why I chose the standard crimping plier is because it corresponds to the size crimp tubes and the size wire that I'm using in my design. I will also need a cutter. A really good quality cutter is always great to have on hand, and this is the one that I use 99.9%, well, maybe 94% of the time in my beading. Something else that's really nice to have on hand, no matter what jewelry making you are doing, is a chain nose pliers. These happen to be a bent chain nose plier. If I need to pull some wire through, if I need to finagle something through a bead, a good pair of chain nose pliers are always great to have when you are doing your beading. So those are the supplies, those are the beads, those are the tools. Now it's time to get stringing. So first things first, I'm going to take my 49 strand wire. I'm going to move the beads and the materials out of the way to give myself a little bit of space to do my project. And I'm going to work directly from the spool. So I'm going to take the clip. Every spool of wire has a little clip around it. I'm going to take that clip, I'm going to lay it to the side, but not too far away, because I'm going to pull out about 18 or so, 20 inches of wire. But I'm going to put that clip back on that spool of wire. And I'm working, this is called working from the spool. So I'm not pulling out wire and cutting it. I'm pulling out wire and I'm putting that clip on so that I'm working directly from the spool. And now we get to the fun part, right? The beads. So for the first strand of my multi-strand necklace, I'm going to be using the 10 millimeter beads. That's the largest beads from the 3-pack that was in the materials list for this project. The largest beads, the 10 millimeter, and then these little 2 to 3 millimeter spinels. So a really nice contrast of design elements between the large beads and the very, very small beads. The spinel beads are acting like a spacer bead because they are creating just a little bit of space in between those large beads. So I'm just going to go ahead and start stringing them up. I always start my design whenever I'm doing any beading with a small bead on the end. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that for this design. And those little spinel beads, they can be a little fiddly, right? They can be a little tough. They can have smaller holes that are a little hard to see. So a couple of tips as you're getting started. The first tip is you want to make sure that the end of your wire is very crisply cut and also cut on an angle. That will make a very, very big difference between how your stringing goes, to make sure that that wire is a really, really nice cut and it's cut just a little bit on an angle, okay? Another tip is to actually put your bead down on your beading mat and let the wire find the hole. My wire just found the hole and I'm gonna tap it on. So don't be intimidated if your beads don't go onto the wire at the very, very first time you try, because you might need to coax them on the wire a little bit. That 10 millimeter bead, that bead went on, no problem. I don't have to worry about him at all. You might be more comfortable picking up those little teeny tiny spinel beads, finding the hole, and poking it through. I'm not having any luck doing that though. So I'm not going to sweat it. I'm going to put that bead down on my beading mat and I am just going to find the hole, just like that, and put that large bead on. Large bead is super easy. I'm going to move some of those off of the string that it was strung on. Find the hole and string that next bead on. And I'm going to continue to do that until I reach the end of this large bead strand of beads. When I was choosing the beads for the class, and I saw these gorgeous, gorgeous tiger eye online, they just spoke to me. I thought it's a beautiful three graduated strand, 6, 8, and 10 millimeters. But then I thought, what could I use in between? And there are so many different things that I could use in between, but these little spinels just seemed perfect. They were sparkly, they were shiny, and they were just small enough, but they just added that extra little bit of flash. But if they're too small for you and your sensibilities and your design aesthetic, please feel free to substitute a different bead here. Maybe my spinels that I love are a little frustrating. I don't mind kind of looking for those holes and allowing the wire to find the bead. And here, I'm trying to get this one on. It's not working for me, so I'm going to look for another one that does want to get onto the wire. I don't mind taking a little bit of extra time to get my design strung up if I know that I'm going to love the final product. So now I have just two beads left in my strand of 10 millimeter beads. I'm going to string that small black spinel, that last 10 millimeter bead, and I always want to make sure that I finish with that smaller bead. So I'm going to go ahead and put that last small bead on. And this is where those bead stoppers come in really handy. They're little springy springs, and I'm going to leave about 5 inches, and I'm going to put that spring right on I'm going to put that spring right onto the wire at the very, very end of that bead strand. And then I'm going to come around to the other end of my wire. I'm going to pull off about 5-6 inches on this side. And this is the time that I'm going to come and snip that wire off of the spool. And I'm going to put another bead stopper right there on the end of my wire. Now this way, I can walk away. I can pick this strand up, and I don't have to worry about my beads falling off of the strand. So it's a little bit of an insurance policy, especially if you aren't 100% sure that that this is your final strong design. You might want to reconfigure this. You might want to move the colors around so that all of the pinks are together and all of the purples are together. I took them directly off of the spool as I was stringing, but you might want to think about different design elements as you're going along. Now, I'm not doing any crimping yet. I'm not worrying about this strand. I'm putting it right to the side. And now I'm going to take that smaller strand, that 8 millimeter strand of tiger eye, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm taking my beading wire, I'm taking the clip off, I'm pulling out about 20 inches, and I'm putting that clip back on the wire. Again, I'm working from the spool in each case as I'm stringing this up. So every time I string my next strand, I'm working straight from the spool, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start with one of those black spinels on the end of my wire, and then I'm going to alternate them with the 8mm beads. Just going to go ahead and cut them off of the temporary strand that they are strung onto. And I'm going to do that very same thing. Very easy. And this is why we love stringing, right? Because it's meditative. It can be almost like a Zen-like trance that you are able to get into as you are stringing up your beads. So make sure that you don't do any doubles or any skips. So you don't want to have 2 black spinels in any of those spaces, and you don't want to have no black spinels in any of those spaces. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to string up that whole strand again. And we will end up taking a couple of beads off of this strand. That's kind of a look ahead spoiler alert, something to be aware of and keep in the back of your mind. But for now, it's easier for me just to go ahead and string up the whole strand and not worry about counts yet, not worry about making sure that my length is 100% the way, 100% correct. I just want to get those beads strung up onto my wire and then move on to the crimping. So I'm going to go ahead and string this all up, and then we'll be ready to string up the last and final strand. So this is a 3-strand necklace, but certainly don't feel like it only has to be a 3-strand necklace. I just did a little check there to make sure that I hadn't forgotten any of the spacer beads, and also that I hadn't done too many spacer beads. Sometimes if I'm not paying attention, or if I step away from a project, I might lose my pattern. So I just want to always give a little double check to make sure that I still have 1 big bead and 1 little bead in each space. Okay, last one on this side. Got that last big bead on, and then I'm going to put that last little bead on as well. Get that pesky hole nice and lined up. And another thing, if you're having trouble with the holes of your beads, check your lighting. You want to make sure that you've got a really good, strong light looking right down at your work. You might have to move it around a little bit as well. But that is one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give beaders, is to make sure that you have really good lighting in your workspace. So just like I did on the first side, I left about 6 inches of wire here and about 6 inches on the other side, and I'm going to clip that from the spool, and I want to make sure that I remember to put a bead stopper on the end, because then I can pick up my strand, I can move it around, I can measure it against either myself or maybe against a bust, and I don't have to worry about those beads falling off. Just as I did on that first strand, I'm going to set that aside, and now we're going to work with our last strand, our 6mm strand of beads, and we'll do that very same pattern. We're going to go big bead, little bead. Our big beads are getting smaller and smaller, but they're still our big beads. And I'm going to alternate them with those little tiny spinel spacers that we're using. So last time, see, and I told you we're going to get a lot of practice with this new or old stringing technique. Again, I'm taking my spool of wire, I'm taking the clip off, I'm pulling out about 20 inches of wire, and I am working from the spool, so I'm going to put that clip back on. I don't have to worry about measuring my wire. I don't have to worry about wasting any wire because I'm working right from the spool. And I might decide, I might change my mind. I might want to do a totally different design, and that's okay. But I haven't cut my wire off of the spool, so I haven't wasted anything. So let me go ahead and snip the thread, that little knot on the end of the beads that I'm using, and I'm going to pull the spinel off of the strand, and I'm going to go ahead and do that very same pattern. 1 spacer bead, 1, now I'm using the 6mm tiger's eye, and I'm just going to string them all up. And because of the multi-strand nature of this necklace, just as I mentioned for that middle strand, I will end up taking a couple of beads off of this strand. So if you want to go ahead, maybe not string it all on, maybe string everything but 10 if you are diametrically opposed to taking beads off of the strand after you have strung them on. I don't mind. So once I get into the rhythm of it, I generally will just kind of go until there are no beads left and then worry about my spacing at the end. But that's up to you. I will allow not finishing the strand. About 10 beads, I think, is what the count is. But your neck and the size that you want to make your necklace could be different than the size of my neck and the size that I want to make my necklace. So the great thing about the clasp that we're using here for our necklace is that it is an extender clasp. So there's about 1.5 inches, I'd say probably about 2 inches here on this clasp, so that you have an extra 2 inches of space on your necklace. So you don't actually have to get it 100% perfect to the size that you want it. And that's great, especially if you're going to be selling your piece. You don't know what size the customer might be, or if you're gifting the piece, you don't know necessarily how the recipient wants their jewelry to lay. They might want it to be more kind of like a choker length, or they might want it to be more like an opera length. So having that extender clasp is a really good way to not have to worry too much about getting it exactly 100% the perfect length. What we will do, however, and what we will worry about is getting it 100% the perfect proportion. And that is very easy to do once we get to the end. And I show you how I lay that out. And there are a couple of different ways, of course, to achieve that goal. I'll talk you through at least one, if not more than one, when we get to that point. But right now, what I'm going to do is just make sure that I don't skip any beads and that I don't double up on any beads. And I'm going to get all of these beads strung up onto my design. So we're coming down the home stretch. We just need to keep on going and get all of those beads strung up. Again, every once in a while, I'm going to stop and just make sure that I've got one big bead and one little bead going along. And I haven't doubled up on anything. And I haven't skipped any beads. Oh my gosh, sometimes these beads can get a little jumpy. Again, if you have one that's just like a little, giving you a little trouble, just put it aside. pick up a different bead that wants to go onto that wire. Okay, so now I am putting on my final small bead. These pesky little critters are giving me some trouble today. So hopefully, as you're making the project, if your beads are giving you a little bit of trouble, you'll take a moment, take a beat, take a breath, make sure that your lighting is really good. And if you need to, take a moment, step away. But also make sure that you have your good magnification. Glasses or a magnifying visor is always a great idea. So I have a couple of beads left here on my strand, but I think I'm in pretty good shape. I can always add or subtract as I'm going along. And on this last strand, just like I did for the other ones, I'm going to use my bead stopper, leaving about 5 or 6 inches on the end. And then I'm going to come to the other end of my wire, and then I'm going to snip it from the spool. And I can put my spool aside because I am done with that for now. Okay, so I only had 5 bead stoppers. So what am I going to do with that? Well, I'll tell you. These bead stoppers are not just a one-trick pony. You can actually put 2 pieces of wire into one bead stopper. So that's a little pro tip for you. If you don't have enough for each and every wire to get its own bead stopper, you can use one bead stopper for more than one wire. So I'm going to go ahead and just clean my work area off here so we can see what's going on without too much distraction. Move the extra beads to the side and push my findings up out of the way, because now we are ready to go ahead and start measuring out our necklace. Make sure that all of our counts are perfect and that it's going to lay right when we put it onto our bodies. And to do that, all I'm going to do is I'm going to lay everything out on my beading mat. If you had a bead board, this would be a great time to use your bead board, but you can see, as I was mentioning, we're going to have to take some beads off up there, because when we come over and I am going to lay my finished design right next to my design in progress, you can see how those beads nestle into each other with not really a whole lot of space in between. And they come up against that, against your clasp or against my clasp, and everything lays really, really nicely, and everything is going to lay on my neck really nicely as well. I'm going to put this back onto the bust, and you'll be able to see just how nicely it lays. So just as it would lay on your neck, you can see how perfectly it lays on the bust, that 3-strand design. So in order to do that, the first thing that we're going to do is onto our triple strand clasp. And I love using clasps like these because it really helps set you up for success. There are 3 holes on one side of the bar and obviously 3 bars on the other side. And so that keeps everything separate and in its proper channel. So we're going to go ahead and just work on one side of the clasp. You can take it apart if you want to, but I tend to, when I'm working with any clasp, try to keep my clasp together as I'm working. And there's one good reason and one practical reason. And the practical reason is that I oftentimes will lose the second part of my clasp, either on a cluttered workspace, maybe it falls off on the floor, maybe I have a furry friend who's going to come and bat it away from me as I'm working with it. So I always try to work with my clasp clasped. The second and more functional reason is because as we're bringing our necklace together, as we're bringing all of our sides together, we want to make sure that we are building our necklace so that it is practical, so that it makes sense, so that all of the strands end up lining up. And again, this guy is way too long. This is going to be way too long. We're going to attend to that after we do our crimping for our first side. So let's get into the meat, the heart of the matter on our project today. We are going to start crimping. And to do our crimping, we are going to use a size 2 crimp tube because it says on my wire right here, I'm using my 49 strand and I'm using my 018 wire. And so because I'm using my 018 diameter wire, I'm going to use my number 2 crimp tube. The wire is always going to tell you what it wants. So you don't have to think about it. You don't have to remember it. You don't have to look up on any chart. Number 2 crimp tube is what I'm going to use. And because I'm using a number 2 crimp tube, I'm going to be using the standard crimping pliers. So let's go ahead and start with our first strand. I like working when I do multi-strand necklaces with beads of different sizes from largest to smallest. I don't think that there's a good rhyme or reason for that. It's just a force of habit. And so that is what I do. That's how I'm going to demonstrate today. But if your brain, if your sensibility feels more comfortable working from smallest to largest, that's okay too. I don't think that there's a real advantage to doing it either way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up that crimp tube, and I'm not even going to worry about doing it in any fancy way. I just have my crimp tube here on my bead mat, and I'm going to pick it up with my wire. Just scoop it right up with my wire. I'm going to then work on one of the outer tubes of my clasp. I don't want to, of course, go into the middle because this is my largest bead strand and I want that to be on the side. It not only allows you to have the exact amount of space in between your clasp and your crimp, it also gives a little bit of extra strength and reinforcement at that join. Especially since we're using beads that are a little heavier, we want to give that wire as much support as we can. And that's what a wire guardian does. And in all honesty, I just think that they look nice. They give a little bit of an extra professional finish to your jewelry making. So to use a wire guardian, you're going to come with your beading wire up one side of that wire guardian, around the top, and then back down the other side. Okay? Before you do anything else, you want to slide your clasp in. And I'm going to work from one side of the clasp. I don't want to put this one in the middle because it's my largest piece or my largest set of beads. So I have that nice wire guardian right around that last tube. And again, before I do anything else, I'm going to very gently with my bent chain nose pliers, I just want to bring the tips of that wire guardian together. So the wire guardian is like this. I want to just very gently bring the two legs of the wire guardian together. And the reason why I do that is because A, it makes it easier to crimp, and B, it makes it so that the ends aren't sticking out. We want to make sure that there's nothing to give a little scratch to the back of our necks, right? We don't want anything that's going to be uncomfortable. And I find that when those wire guardians are kind of flared out a little bit, they just make that little bit of scratch that I don't want. So bring them together, no scratch. Okay, so I haven't taken my bead stopper off yet, but I'm going to now work with that crimp tube and slide it up over those two wires. So now we're going to talk about crimping, the most important foundational skill that you can have in your skill set to do proper bead stringing, proper jewelry making. Crimping is a 3-step process. With the crimp tool, you're going to use 2 parts of that jaw. Let me get that right, really nice and tight. So you can see there's the back part of the jaw that has a little bit of a dimple, a little bit of a bend in the back of it. and then the front part of that jaw is totally smooth. So what we're going to do is we are going to do 3 steps. First in the front, then in the back, and then back in the front again. Okay? So before we do that, I want to set myself up for success. I want to set my wire up for success. And my wire is going to want to cross in that crimp tube. It just does. That's what the wire wants to do. But I want to try very, very hard and holding with my thumbnail to make sure that that wire does not cross in that crimp tube. Because while we're crimping, what we're doing is we are taking those wires and we're putting them in a channel on one side and on the other side. We don't want them crossed. We don't want them smashed. We don't want them jammed in there any way. We want that wire in the crimp tube to be hugging and holding our wire so that our jewelry is made properly and it's strong and it's built to last. So let's set ourselves up for success. First step first, we're going to come in the front of that crimp tube. I also want to make sure, because I am adding a crimp cover. There are a lot of things to keep in mind as we're doing this. Because I'm adding a crimp cover, I'm going to need to leave about 1 millimeter extra of space to account for that crimp cover. But as I'm doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, in the front part of my jaws of my plier, I'm going to squeeze down and I'm going to turn my crimp tube into an oval, okay? And what that does is it sets me up for success when I come into the back jaw of my crimping pliers. I want to make sure that my wires are not crossed in here. I want to make sure that I have left 1 millimeter of space to account for my crimp cover. And I'm going to squeeze down and I'm going to turn my crimp tube into a jelly bean. And you can see that one wire is on one side, one wire is on the other side, and there's a little dimple in the middle that has made my crimp tube into a jelly bean. So I have 1 step left. I'm going to come back into the front jaw of those pliers, the front of the jaw of the pliers, and I'm going to squeeze down again. And I'm going to move my plier around and around and around and around and around, chomping down to make sure that that wire is 100% crimped as well as possible. And I'm going to give a pretty substantial tug to make sure that it took. So my crimp is done well. I have just a little bit of extra space in there to account for my crimp cover. My wires are not crossed within my crimp tube, and I have not done any smushing of this wire. That's where people really run the risk of having jewelry that does not stay together over time. If you crush those individual strands of cable, your wire is going to be very, very unhappy. And over time, it will weaken, and unfortunately, it could break. But if you crimp well, if you crimp with a good technique and you make sure that the crimp tube is holding the wire in place, not cutting into it, not flattening it and smushing it down, you'll have really, really great jewelry that's going to last a lifetime. But we are not done yet. We have only done 1 of those crimps. We've got 5 left to go. So next step is to do that very same thing, to repeat it on that middle strand, that second size bead, that middle size bead, those 8 millimeter beads. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to add my crimp tube. I'm going to add my wire guardian. I'm going to go up one side of my wire guardian, down the other side of my wire guardian. Before I go back through my crimp tube, I'm going to add that wire to the middle of my clasp. And then I'm going to go back through my wire. Now, it's tempting to want to leave as little wire here as possible. I leave about 2 inches, and I'll have even more on the other side. It gives me a little bit more purchase. It gives me a little bit more to work with. Try not to leave your tails really, really small in the interest of saving wire. Having a little bit of waste wire here is actually a really good thing and is going to make it a lot easier in the long run to make your jewelry and to have it work easily. So I used my chain nose pliers just to squeeze that wire guardian shut. I want to make sure that my wires are not crossed. I'm going to come in here with my crimping pliers in the front, in the back, and then in the front again. And I'm going to go around and around. And then just like that, get a little tug. I'm ready for the third one. Oh my goodness. All right, so now we're ready for that third strand. And of course I use the double bead stopper technique on my third strand. So I can go ahead and just take that bead stopper off of one of the strands and use that just like we did before. This is very repetitive now. I've got my crimp tube, my wire guardian up, around, and down. And this is a great project. Any multi-strand project is really great for practicing crimping. And I am a firm believer that you can't have enough practice on crimping. It is just one of those skills that is the most important to master as you are making jewelry. Because if you can crimp well and crimp properly, your jewelry is going to last. There won't be any problems with things breaking, with things being returned. You know that everything is going to last for a lifetime. So once again, I did. Wasn't even thinking about it, but I put my the sides of my wire guardians together. I'm using my crimp tool in the front of my pliers, making sure that my wires aren't crossed. I'm going to the back of my crimping pliers, and then just want to make sure that I got that one really nicely. I'm coming up and around and up and down that crimp too, and then back in the front. One of the things that I see people do a lot with crimping is just thinking that the tool is going to do the proper job for them and not really looking and seeing what they're doing and taking the time to make sure that they're crimping properly. It really does take a little finessing and a little zhuzhing to make sure that your crimps are crimped really, really well. So now what are we going to do with these wires here? Well, I can go ahead and take that bead stopper off. Oftentimes when we are beading, we will tuck these wires back into our design, but we're using these small holds gemstones here on the end. So we won't be able to do that on this project today, and that's okay. That tucking in of the wire ends doesn't actually have any structural integrity. All it does is just kind of have a little bit of an aesthetic integrity to have that wire tucked back in. So I'm going to go ahead and snip these wires off. And because I'm using crimp covers, I don't have to worry about those little ends being owie or snaggy in any way, because I'm going to use a crimp cover to cover them up. And before I even get to the last side, the second side of my necklace, I'm actually going to go ahead and add those crimp covers. It's a little bit easier, in my opinion, to do that before my necklace is finished. So I like to do things that are going to be easier on myself, right? Don't we all? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add those 3 crimp covers on this side. So what is a crimp cover? A crimp cover is a little Pac-Man shaped piece of metal. And that little Pac-Man shaped piece of metal can go over your crimp tube or your crimp bead, just to add a little bit of an aesthetic appeal. It doesn't have a structural function, except in this case, we're using it to cover up those little wire ends so they don't get scratchy on the backs of our necks. But structurally, the wire guardian and the crimp tube are doing all of the work here. The crimp cover is looking pretty, and it's also helping to make sure that those little ends don't scratch the back of our necks. So there are two ways to get a crimp cover onto a piece of jewelry. And the first is what I'm going to be showing today. My favorite way of closing a crimp cover is using a chain nose or a bent chain nose or even a flat nose plier. And again, small incremental steps go a long way to making sure that your crimp cover is really, really nicely covered. So I'm just going to come in here and gently work this from side to side until my crimp cover is closed. Just working it really slowly back and forth so that those seams line up and my crimp cover has gone from Pac-Man to bead. You can also use a mighty crimping plier to do this, the smooth part of the mighty crimping You can also use the smooth part of the mighty crimping plier to do this. I've done that before with great success, but for me personally, using a chain nose plier just works better. The mighty crimping plier might be something that works best for you, and I encourage you to definitely try different techniques until you find the one that works best for you. So I'm going to go ahead and do that very same thing with the next two crimp tubes. I'm going to get my crimp cover centered over the crimp tube, and I'm going to come in and just gently squeeze it together. And this takes a nice gentle touch, a finesse, if you will. And sometimes you can really mangle that crimp cover, and you definitely don't want that to happen. If you do, it's actually not the end of the world. They're not terribly difficult to cut off, but you will have to start over with another crimp cover. I've never mangled a crimp cover and then spent the time or had the inclination to make sure or to try to put it back into shape. Not worth my time for sure. All right, 2 down, 1 to go. Let's do that last crimp cover. I'm gonna get him on. And over that crimp tube, and go ahead and just very gently close it up. And you can see why I needed to add just a millimeter or two in between the crimp tube and the wire guardian to account for the space that the crimp cover is going to take up, and we'll have to account for that on the other side as well. All right, one side done. Good job, guys. All right, let me put all of these in order now and hope that indeed, yep, I got the largest, the medium size, and the small. You never know. Sometimes you put the wrong things on the wrong sides. It's happened to all of us before. I'm going to just use my bead mat as my workspace here to get these nice and laid out. I will have to reposition my bead stoppers because I want to take up that slack as I am sizing and figuring out how many beads I need to take off in order to get my necklace to be even and straight. Okay. So I want to work with this kind of toward me as if it's a necklace, and I can move my findings out of the way a little bit, but I'm going to need them for the next side, of course. And let's go ahead and lay this out. Oh, these tiger eye beads are just so beautiful, and I love them in the colors. It's a little different than you might expect. So they're so beautiful. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to put this into the shape of a necklace. So I'm just kind of incrementally moving this around. And all right, look at what we have here. We have a long, much longer piece, another much longer piece, and this is the piece right here. This is the one that we need to measure everything else too. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start removing some beads. And it looks like if I remove about that many beads, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 beads in this case, that's going to be perfect. Your counts might be different. There are different variations in the size of beads that just make it so I hesitate to say 20 beads, 16 beads, 14 beads, or whatever it's going to be, because your count might be just a little bit different than my count. And as we are learning to make jewelry, as we are learning how to make multi-strand designs, it's really important to know how to do this without actually just counting the beads. Because again, your pattern, the beads that you use, might be a little bit different than the instructions. So you want to make sure that you know how to make all of the beads line up rather than just doing it by counts. Because like I said, there are individual variations in strands, there are individual variations in beads, there are individual variations in maybe how long you want your necklace to be. Maybe you have chosen to do different beads for your design. So I like how that's coming out, but now that I've removed a couple beads and I'm moving my necklace around, looks like I have to remove just a couple more. You can see over here that it's still not lining up quite right. I would rather just take a couple off, remeasure it, take a couple off, remeasure it, then have to rebead or restring beads at this point. But if you need to add a couple, that's totally fine too. We're just kind of in the measuring and seeing portion of our designing, just to make sure that everything is even and you're going to end up with a finished design that you like. And at this stage, also what you can do is work on a bust, right? So I'm going to take my finished design off of the bust, and I'm actually going to put my sample here onto the bust. And I can see that it's going to, checking my work in the camera and in front of me, it looks like it's going to lay really, really nicely. So I'm very pleased with how those counts ended up. I think that that's going to be a really good way to do it. I'm just going to put it back on my bead mat and double check. I do a lot of double and triple and quadruple checking when I'm doing my jewelry. It is born from years of mistake making. And that is, sometimes mistakes are happy mistakes. Sometimes mistakes are unhappy mistakes, but they're always learning opportunities. And I try to really approach it like that. Every time maybe something doesn't end up quite the way I wanted it to, well, I've learned from that. And next time I'll make sure that I do a little bit better. I think I want to take that one off as well. And I do have a nice extension chain here, so that's how I'm able to keep a nice length of my necklace, even though I'm taking beads off. I know that it's still going to be able to be adjustable and a good length of necklace. And I think I've got it. I think we're good and we're ready to go ahead and crimp the second side. So the same way that we did the first side with our crimping, we're going to add our crimp tube, our wire guardian back around our clasp and around and through. But this side takes a little bit of extra finessing. Couple of things to keep in mind. One, we want to make sure that it's not too tight, but we also want to make sure that it's not too loose. So it's a very, very fine line between a necklace that has gaps in places where you can see the wire, and a necklace that has the proper amount of wiggle room to be able to not put any additional tension on the wire. That's really, really important. Oftentimes our inclination is to take our beaded strand, hold it up, make sure it's as tight as humanly possible. Well, crimp it up here, crimp it down here. But then when you go to put it on, it's this very stiff piece. Well, what ends up happening with that very stiff piece is the beads are gonna win. The beads, because they're not going anywhere. And when you put that on, the beads are going to cause your wire that's stranded and wrapped together, it's going to unwrap. And so over time, your necklace is going to end up sagging. You want to make sure that you don't have that problem in your jewelry. And so you want to build in some really nice wiggle room. And we're going to do that right now. So I like to start, so here I started with my biggest strand. When I do my second side, I like to start with my smallest strand. Is there a rhyme or reason to it? There might be, but that is just the way that I go about doing my jewelry. So once again, number 2, crimp 2, because that's what my wire taught me to do. I'm going to thread that on. I'm going to take my wire guardian. I'm going to go up one side of my wire guardian. I'm going to come back down the other side of my wire guardian. And I'm going to find my clasp. Now I want to make sure that I'm on the outer edge. Now, of course, because this is a clasp that it could go to left to right or right to left. It doesn't matter if I'm on the top of that clasp or the bottom. I just need to make sure that I'm not in the middle. So I'm going to go on one side. I'm going to string that wire down. I'm going to string that wire through that crimp tube. And I'm going to snug everything up. Notice I said snug. I didn't say tighten, okay? Because again, 2 things we need to build in here. First, we need to build in 1 millimeter on either side of that crimp tube to account for our crimp cover. And we also need that wiggle room that gives the wire enough room to dance so that it is not going to push against everything and ultimately fail. So I have everything nice and tightened up. There are no gaps in my wire. I want to make sure it's tightened up to the other side here. Snug, but not tight. And I'm going to hold everything in place. I'm going to come in again with my crimping pliers. And in the front jaw of those pliers, I'm going to need to round it out. I'm going to do my very best to make sure that that wire is not crossed in the crimp. It's a little bit more of a challenge on this side, especially as I'm trying to make sure that I have enough room on both sides to account for my crimp cover. A really good way to do that, and you saw me do it right there, is to measure with my fingernail. If I just kind of wedge my fingernail down in there really, really tight, or not really tight, so that it can move back and forth, that gives me assurance that I've got a pretty good amount of space in between each side. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to, I've already rounded it, right? I want to make sure that, or I've already turned it to an oval, I should say. I want to make sure that my wires are not crossed and I have enough room. So whoever said that stringing was not something that you had to pay close attention to, they were wrong. Because you really do have to pay good attention when you're doing stringing and when you are crimping. And then I'm going to come around here and I'm going to chomp, chomp, chomp around and around and around. Give that a tug, make sure that it is holding. And I'm going to snip that wire off, and I'm going to breathe a big sigh of relief because my first strand on my second side is done. I am almost finished with my multi-strand necklace. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do that same series of steps on the medium size beads and on the largest beads. And then I'm going to add my crimp covers and we're going to be done with the project. So lots to learn when you're doing crimping, right? It's not just as simple as bang, bang, and you're done. You really need to pay attention to the technique. You need to pay attention to making sure that you don't have too much space, but you have enough space. You want to make sure that your wires are not crossed within that crimp tube. And you want to make sure that you have allowed enough space if you do decide to use a crimp cover. And again, in this case, the crimp cover is optional. You don't have to use a crimp cover. You don't ever have to use a crimp cover. But I like using a crimp cover in this case because I have those little wires that I can't tuck back through. And because I have a little bit of a wire tail that's sticking out there, I don't want that rubbing either my neck or my customer's neck or my gift recipient's neck. So I want to cover that up with a crimp cover. So I need to make sure that I allow for that space. And you can see I'm being pretty careful here. I'm checking things a couple of times, making sure that my wires are not crossed. I am coming in and making sure that I've gotten a really nice second pass with my crimp tool, coming back and making sure that I am folding it over as well as I possibly can. And then I'm going to come in with my nice tight pliers and snip that as close to that crimp tube as I can. Okay. And now I'm ready for the last one. Same thing. And that's, again, this is a great project for practicing your crimping. And you cannot practice crimping too much. It's a foundational skill. It's like doing a wrapped loop or a simple loop, something that you have to practice over and over again in order to keep it and to keep the muscle memory of doing it the right way. Okay, for just a moment there, I thought I got my wires crossed, but I'm good. I've got my medium on the center, and then the largest wire or the largest beads are on the outermost wires. So I'm going to come back down here through my crimp tube, pull that wire out with my bent chain nose pliers. I'm just very, very gently. I'm not smushing. Oops, you know what? I wasn't so gentle there. I don't know if you can see that I got a little bit of a twist in that wire guardian. I'm going to very gently fix that twist. So if you get it just a little wrong and those legs of the wire guardian, if they cross over each other, either start over again with a different wire guardian, which is very, very easy to do, or just like I did, just give a little bit of a correctional chomp of the wire guardian and you should be in good shape. But it's better to set that one aside and start fresh with a wire guardian whose legs aren't crossed if you've really mangled it. All right, we've got our last one. Coming in the front of my crimping plier, making it into a round shape, coming into the back and turning it into a jelly bean, then coming back to the very front and circling it around and around and around and around. A little tug to make sure everything took, and snip off that wire tail as close as I can. And if you're having a little trouble getting in there, just kind of figure out the best way to finagle it around so that you can get a nice, tight snip of that wire. Perfect. Okay, and the last thing I have to do here, and I'm just double checking to make sure that I left enough room to accommodate my crimp covers, and it looks like I did. It's always something I'm nervous about. Oh, did I remember that? And why do I know? Because many times I have not accounted for the space on my crimp covers, and I've gotten to the end or to the other side and thought, oh no, now my wire is going to be too tight. So again, just with my chain nose pliers, very, very gently, I'm bringing the sides of my Pac-Man together so that I have a nice clean seam. I'm going to do that 2 more times. And again, crimp covers can be a little fiddly. They just need a little bit of patience and sometimes a little cajoling to get into the right spot. And if crimp covers aren't your friends, if you find no joy or happiness from using crimp covers, don't use them. It's totally fine to use just a crimp tube or a crimp bead and not worry about a crimp cover. If wire guardians are giving you a real hard time, I like using them because I think that they look nice. I think that they add a little bit of extra strength to the end of the wire. They help me get the proper distance between the wire and the crimp. Between the crimp tube and the clasp, because you definitely don't want no room, right? You need about 1/8 of an inch of a loop to make sure that your wire isn't super too tight against your clasp. But if wire guardians, if they're just too fiddly for you or they're not working out, that's okay. They are not a must-have. They're not a must-have. They're a nice-to-have. You just want to make sure that if you're not using a wire guardian, that you're leaving at least 1/8 of an inch of space between your clasp and where you're doing your crimp tube. But I think that they look great. I think that they look nice, and they really make a finished piece look more finished with both the wire guardians and the crimp covers. So I'm going to go ahead and I am going to put this now finished piece not back, I'm going to put it over on the bust for the first time. So let's check it out and see how it looks. Let me get that nice and, oh, look at that. That looks fantastic. I really like how it's laying. I like how there is the graduated space in between each of the strands. And I think whoever I gift that to, or if I want to wear it myself, I think that that's going to look really, really nice as a piece of jewelry. Maybe with a scoop neck shirt or a t-shirt. You could wear this with so many different things, and the beads have so many different colors in them. I think it would really look beautiful with anything that you made. So thank you so much for joining me for this class for the Jewel School workshop. This multi-strand necklace taught a lot of skills. We used wire guardians, we used crimp covers, we did a lot of crimping. We learned about spacing our design. We learned about doing a multi-strand design and having it lay correctly. So once again, I am Meredith Roddy from Beading and Artistic Wire, and I hope to see you soon. And until then, happy beading.